today. We're going to talk with Chris Walker. Chris Walker is one of the best B2B creators in the world. For the last 4 to 5 years, he has posted every single day on LinkedIn. He has created more than 500 episodes of his podcast. In both of those, he has developed a listenership and an audience that is top 1% in the world. Today, we talk about how he has set up the systems to be able to do that on a repeatable, ongoing framework, while at the same time being the CEO of an 8-figure company and being able to juggle both. We're going to talk about how companies can win today creating content for the organic, social, and content platforms that their buyers hang out on. So I hope you enjoy. Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and get started here. I mean, people are going to roll in. Obviously, the topic of today is how to build a content engine for dark social. What we're going to do is we're going to go through, Chris and I jamming for a little bit, and then we will open it up to any Q&A. So if you have Q&A, I would just go ahead now and put any questions you have in the chat, and then we will, work through those. If you're cool with, joining live and asking that live on the call, great. If not, we'll try to just, touch on that as well, just based on the question in the chat. But yeah, Chris, today, let's go ahead and get started. I think a really great place to start here for context is let's define and set a little bit of the context on, a content engine and dark social. So obviously dark social is something that, you've championed for a long time. You've talked a lot about, but I just think for clarity here, especially since that's a central theme of today's topic, let's break down, what dark social is and why it's important, and then what a content engine is and why it's important.
Yeah. First off, what's up, everyone? Great to be here. I don't get enough opportunities. I haven't gotten enough opportunities recently to really talk about content and what we do in content, some of the things that we're learning and how we've evolved. I've been doing this, creating content for my own businesses for the past 5 years, creating content for B2B businesses on social since 2015. I had a B2B podcast that I was the host of in 2016 for a medical device company. I've been in it for quite some time. And I think I'm going to get to your questions, Eric, I promise. But the thing that I've come and I've tried to communicate really clearly to people, and I've seen this for a long time, but it should be clear to almost everybody now that organic social media content is the number one driver to you be having an effective marketing strategy today. How good you are at these channels has a dramatic correlation to your customer acquisition cost, as well as your growth rate, as well as the long-term sustainability and scalability of your go-to-market engine. It's a completely different way of marketing than the traditional B2B playbook. And so I wanted to put that out there because it's very clear. And I think people do not take seriously the impact of social media content specifically, while they watch people like me, people like Adam Robinson, people like, I don't name off the top of his head, CEO at Clary, or all of these other influencers, business owners, CEOs, investors that have gotten significant personal financial gains, have had significant improvements to the enterprise value of their business or the growth of their business, or all of these things on the back of their presence on LinkedIn or other social media platforms. And so just pushing that as the top level, that we need to be taking this very seriously now, not only as a marketing manager, but as a CEO, as an executive. And so we'll start there. Dark social is effectively just the scale of the internet and all the different places where content can be distributed, shared, commented on, engaged with, has fundamentally changed over the past 10 years from just being available in Google. You can remember, people that have been around for a while, there was a time where there were no social media platforms, where a B2B company didn't have a LinkedIn profile, where you couldn't even post content on LinkedIn. And the acceleration of the internet, especially post-COVID, and how people use these types of places has fundamentally changed, where you have LinkedIn, YouTube, podcast, virtual events, text messages, Slack channel, email, tons of other places, where specifically in social networks, the benefit is that you put content in and you can reach a bunch of people in a way that's very different than sending your email to your 5,000 person email list, where no one's going to forward your email to another 10,000 people. But in social, you can put it on there and get reach and awareness to people that do not know you, that don't follow you, things like that. And then from there, those people can see that content. They can follow you. They can also click the link. They can screenshot the image. They can go and share that in a Slack channel with other people in their company or other colleagues that they have. And so content starts in one place, typically social, or in a podcast or a top level place, and then permeates its way into all these other places through the sharing of people, which, by the way, is the most trustworthy thing that can happen. As me as a CEO screenshotting an ad or an organic post and linking it and sending it to my CMO or my CFO and say, hey, we got to go and look at this, or hey, I really think you should understand this, and having your content be shared with the buying group inside of your company, where you're not the one sharing it, someone else in the company is sharing it for you. That type of stuff also facilitates what is primarily the way that B2B companies buy today, which is independent research and buying. They have available information everywhere, from review sites to the content that you produce, all the content your competitors produce, thought leaders, analyst firms, all of these, their peers, colleagues, other CMOs, their VCPE firm, all these other places where they're going to get information outside of your sales team. And they're going to go and take that information, whether they get it organically, whether it comes to them, or they go out and seek it and find it and start to share it inside of their company, discuss it in meetings, share it in Slack, and eventually start to make decisions around what are the biggest priorities in the business. And the content that you produce that gets shared there can influence business priorities, how budget gets allocated, what things that they buy versus what they don't buy, whether they choose you or a competitor. And so just trying to push really hard on the seriousness about this specific thing, which I don't believe is sure, it falls under the marketing department a lot, but this is a business strategy now. It's a whole different way to think about how we get our target customers educated on our product, which used to be bang the phones, outbound sales, field sales in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And then it turned into heavy SEO and SEM and advertising and things like that to go out and just pound people with ads to get leads. And now it really is using organic content that provides a ton of value that starts getting shared to other people. And then once that content is proven, then you can layer paid on top of it to go out and get to the people that you want. And I'll talk through our content and process. But I just wanted to start there because I think that for a lot of people that might be listening to this podcast afterwards, I think that social media is just generally undervalued, and trying to push this to, if you see all the people that are winning right now, all the companies that are growing fast and don't have decelerating growth in the tough economy that we're in, a lot of them are the ones that are crushing on social today.
Yeah, and a big reason, which you talk a lot about, of why companies deprioritize it is the dark part, is that it's not easy to see somebody sharing that in their Slack channel or inbounding, and it looks like they, had a gateway through Google, and so it looks like Google sent them, but really it was the content that powered that. And we'll touch a little bit on that later in terms of like how to know this is working, both in platform metrics, but also overall results, revenue, pipeline, things like that. But the first thing that is needed for any of this to work is the engine. It is the content engine piece of it. And I think there's probably, from my standpoint, two reasons people don't do it. One, they don't know if it'll work, or they're, kind of afraid to start creating content of what people will think about them, how much expertise they have and things like that. Or they don't think they have the time and it's too complicated. It's too much of a lift to get started. And so this is where the engine piece, comes in play. And so, yeah, I'm curious how you just think about the content engine in general, like, starting from scratch, how do you think about getting that content engine piece off the ground?
Yeah. So first off, in terms of like the resistance, like I had salespeople laugh at me for making a podcast for our business in 2016. I had the CEO laugh at me for suggesting that we run Facebook ads to our target customers in an account-based marketing motion in 2016. And both of those things were the best opportunities in marketing at that time. And so I totally empathize with the resistance that people feel about trying to get these things implemented, whether it's in 2016 or 2021 or now. It's part of it is the measurement, but most of it is the mindset. Most of it is that for whatever reason, people have not been able to get to break through to these people around how much the world is changing and where the opportunity actually lies. Part of that is where executives get their information from. But just wanted to sort of to note that when you think about the engine, and I like to separate this because no matter how good you are at doing a live event and posting on LinkedIn and adding the hashtags and making sure you post at this time and being able to edit the content so it goes on YouTube Shorts, the process and workflow matter, but only matter as much as do you have a differentiated point of view? Are you saying something that your target customer values, that gets them to think, that challenges them to think in a different way, that gets them interested in sharing it with somebody else, that drives them to think about making a change in their business? And so we have to, I'm going to eliminate that from the conversation soon because we'll get into the more of the process. But I just need to say that part is a huge variable of success that a lot of people don't consider when they think about starting a podcast. They just think, okay, I'll show up, I'll record 3 podcasts, they'll go on Apple Podcasts, I'll post a couple times on LinkedIn, and magically this strategy is going to work. It really is only going to work if you are saying things that matter to your target customer. So that's a huge variable. I'm not interested in going into that in much detail today, but I just needed to say that. So let's assume that you have a product that customers love and you have a message and strategy that makes people think and challenges them to think and drives them to action. Now let's get into the things that become very repeatable if those pieces are in place. Number one is that you need to have a recurring flag in the ground, pillar types of content that are long form video content. That could be, and there's a lot of different varieties and mediums. It could be your CEO being a guest on a podcast. It could be you hosting a weekly webinar that I do every week where you invite people and you show up and you take Q&A. It could be as simple as you interviewing your chief product officer around the stuff in your product once a month and using that as a piece of pillar content. Finding a way on a recurring basis, weekly, biweekly, monthly, quarterly, that you have something that's on the calendar, ideally where you're going to have a audience that's similar to your target audience there, where you are communicating a perspective around where you think the world is going while also providing a bunch of value to your audience. And you can have multiple. So there are certain things that I do every week, like I do my live event on Tuesday every single week. People show up, we ask questions, that becomes one pillar. Once a month, I do, and I just did it, a collaboration with my company, Refine Labs, where we have a thought leader on and I'm interviewing them. Once a month or once a quarter, I'm going to be doing something with Erik, and we're going to do something all around content, and that's going to be a pillar. And so you have these core things that keep the engine running, where it's on the calendar, people are going to show up, you have to go and put something out. You can have one-offs. You can do you do your customer user conference, or you do some big one-off event where a lot of content is recorded is great too. But you can't just do one event and then just push it through. You need to have recurring, and then you can slot in one-offs with it. And that creates long-form video and audio content. That's the base content. That long-form content can be almost cut immediately and put on YouTube in like 15 minutes. You immediately have a YouTube video. Think about whether you use a person or AI to do the search engine optimization and the titling and the thumbnailing and all that different stuff. And then you have a long-form landscape YouTube video. You edit, you cut the audio, then all of a sudden you have a long-form podcast episode that goes on Apple and Spotify and other places. With a little bit of AI or manual work, then you can take that video and or that audio long form and you can make a web page about it and put it on your website under a podcast section. And then you have your long form raw assets inside of core distribution channels. Then it gets into a little bit more of the production where now you're going to start to cut those clips for video content on the platforms based on your level of prioritization. For most of us, the level of prioritization will be LinkedIn organic, YouTube Shorts, and then potentially like a TikTok or another medium like that. But really, where we're playing, I think LinkedIn and YouTube Shorts are the place. TikTok has better reach than YouTube Shorts, for the record, but YouTube Shorts has the advantage that it's starting to show up in Google. If you search sales cycle versus sales velocity, my YouTube Short video is showing up toward the top of that post. And none of my companies spend a bunch of time on SEO, but just because we have a short and Google owns YouTube and is prioritizing that in search results. And so that's why I think that YouTube Shorts has a advantage over TikTok when you think about selling to a B2B executive. And then you have short form content that's produced. And then you need to think about how you distribute that short form content inside of social networks, a combination of video and then the copy, especially on LinkedIn. The copy that goes with the video really matters. You will get a massive difference in performance if you say in the copy, check out this video, and then you post the video, versus you writing about what you're talking about in the video, having a great intro hook that gets people interested, that gets people to consume the video and different things like that. So I think people undervalue the copy when they think about video marketing on LinkedIn. And then you have the short form social distribution. And then you get all of the feedback inside of the comments that happen inside of social. And then you can use those comments to think about what we talk about in the event, and you create this flywheel. And that is like the base flywheel: event, long form content inside of core distribution, short form content inside of core distribution. That is the level one that people want to get to when they think about a content engine. So before you start thinking about how do we get AI to write our blog posts, how do we start, making Instagram reels, how do we start thinking about how to use AI to get this in Reddit, before we start thinking about the advanced stuff, build that core engine. Just start with LinkedIn. Just even ignore YouTube Shorts to make the video post-production easier. Just think about long form YouTube and podcasts, and then LinkedIn. And then from there, you can add layers on it based on what you're hearing from your audience. And the layers are just you taking the exact same raw content, repackaging it for a new distribution medium, and then distributing it on a recurring basis. And so once you have the engine going, adding new channels requires money, it requires effort, it requires figuring out a new distribution channel, but you don't have to re-architect an entirely new strategy. It's just fitting into an existing workflow.
Great points all around. There's a lot we could touch on, pretty much at every section there. We've got some questions coming in. We'll take those here soon. So keep them coming. One thing I want to touch on amongst a few things with what you just shared, which was great, is the live recurring event. So obviously, like, the recurring pillar can be, I like to think of it in formats. Like, it could be a TV show like series. It could be a short form series. It could be you guesting on podcasts. It could be your content marketer interviewing you each week. It could be a variety of things, but in different formats. One that you've really liked and championed very strongly for, I think, 4 years now. I think you and Gaetano started in COVID, with your very first one like 4 years ago. You've probably done hundreds at this point. But what do you like about the live component that we're doing right now in comparison to just, a more standard, which is obviously still very effective, podcast format or non-live component? Like, what do you get with the live that you don't otherwise? Obviously, you get, for at least your workflow and one that we use, which is like the email registration. So people register. You've got the email addresses that you can, email the content out to afterwards, and, maybe use that later on for other means and things like that. But what, of course, the feedback and questions and like, market research and information you can get with the two-way communication, because like one of the biggest problems with content creation in a lot of formats is it's one way, like, especially when you're recording video content. Sure, you can get YouTube comments, you can get people like replying in comments to your LinkedIn post about your video content. But when you release a podcast episode, like, that's just going out, and there's no way to know, like, you can see the numbers going up and stuff like that, but it's really hard to get that anecdotal subjective feedback. So how do you what is it about the live component for you specifically that you like?
There's three core things. The first one is that when all of you are registered to show up, it's a lot harder to cancel. If you just have, oh, my marketing manager is going to interview me for 15 minutes at 2:30 on a Tuesday for our podcast, and all of a sudden as a CEO, I have a fire, I have something else going on, some big customer wants to have a meeting about their renewal. There's a million things that can come up, can say, oh, like, I guess we can just cancel that podcast. It creates a different level of accountability to being there. One. Number two is that the people that attend the event participate in the content that you create. They give you the questions. They give you feedback on your ideas, that you can see heads nodding or not. So they participate in what's happening. So if you have your target customer on there as a group and they're asking certain questions, you better believe that all the other target customers out there are thinking and asking similar things. So the content that you then send on social or podcast or other things has a different level of validation that it works for your audience than if you just made something up and just put it out. And then third, the feedback allows you to iterate on how you explain things and how you message things that you don't get the feedback on if you just post on LinkedIn or you record a podcast by yourself as a monologue. That you don't see the head nod, you don't get the question, you don't say somebody that comes and says, hey, what you said doesn't make sense. Can you explain it to me in a different way? And those types of things help in an iterative fashion where you don't feel that effect when you release your first podcast, but then when you're on podcast 50, your ability to explain a certain concept to your target audience becomes so much more tight, so much more sharp. So there's a product marketing strategy element that also comes into it with the feedback that your audience provides. And I think there's probably others, like you get the emails and things like that. But to me, those are the top three.
And are you just sort of indexing those in your, in your subconscious, like over time, basically, like you're seeing recurring themes coming from the audience that you're then incorporating into like more content in the future? Or do you think like, hey, let's actually index, all of this stuff and use that to power like what the audience wants?
It's not super scientific, so I'll be clear about that. And like interesting thing, I guess, an advantage some would say about me is that I do a bunch of consulting in my companies that I own with CMOs and chief revenue officers and CEOs and CFOs of these companies. And so I'm on the ground with these people, understanding the consistent patterns of issues that are going on and things like that, that then I can take back and drive forward the things that I'm talking about with my audience, not just relying on my audience to tell me where to go. And so the audience becomes more of a refinement mechanism of where I already am trying to go versus me relying on the audience to bring me there. If you rely on your audience to bring you somewhere, you'll get into a point of stagnation, terminal velocity, where you're answering the same things over and over again. So you have to have some level of other customer insights that are driving you forward where the audience comes along.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's almost the concept of like, having to perform a little bit. So like, I actually think that is a good topic for us right now. You've done, I mean, hundreds or thousands of these at this point. And so like, one of the most important things for all of this is that it is sustainable so that you can continue to do it and not stop. And one of the best ways to do that is to not feel like you're having to perform and not be yourself to a large degree throughout this process, because that is inherently not sustainable. So how do you think about like staying authentic to yourself, but also making this something that is, super compelling every single week after week, month after month, year after year, so that the compounding actually takes place? Like, how do you actually think about performing well during doing this and doing these sessions?
I think a key for anybody, but especially for an executive, is make it as easy as possible for yourself. If I had a bunch of homework where I had to put together a 30-slide deck every week in order to present it to you, and then it would feel like a chore. And so it could be different. Some people might love to present with a deck, and that might be their way, but you have to figure out what works for you and make it as easy as possible for you. So that's one. Um, Another one is to really be focused on talking about things that you really understand. I think a lot of people that try to create content try to pretend like they understand something more than they do, or regurgitate the thoughts of somebody else and copy someone else's thoughts. And I think being really focused on the things that you really understand, I think is just makes it way easier to go about it, because eventually you'll be on this event, somebody asks you a question, and you're going to be exposed that you don't really know what you're talking about when you talk about things that you don't know. And it's easy. If someone asks me a question here and they ask me something about, I don't know, Nvidia's stock, and I don't know anything about it, I'm going to say, somebody else is going to know that better than me. I don't really have an opinion there. And I think that creates authenticity too, being clear to people when you don't have an answer. And then lastly, at least this is for me, it might not be the same for everyone, but if I came on here for 4 years in a row and had to talk about the same thing every time, I would go crazy. And so you need to have a personal evolution of the things that you're learning, the things that you're talking about. If people have noticed my content over the past 4 years, like at the beginning, I talked about, very detailed, like how to run a LinkedIn ad, how to build a piece of content. And now I'm layering up to SaaS financial metrics, how growth and EBITDA are impacting enterprise values, what's happening with Salesforce stock and how that impacts the rest of the bottom of the SaaS market. And that's something that excites me. That's something where the evolving from, the topics that are very, very interesting to a marketing manager to now talking about topics that are very, very interesting to a CFO and a CEO that also provide a lot of value to a marketing manager. That evolution for me is something that keeps me personally interested and excited about doing these things. And it comes at the expense of the algorithm. It comes at the expense of the engagement. People, like, if I just kept regurgitating the same demand gen talk, I would have the most likes on LinkedIn. And through the evolution of my thinking, you go into different places that maybe it's more narrow, maybe it's more niche, maybe it's less understood. Your engagement metrics will decline. There's an easy example for this, for people. Like if you think about like Instagram models, right? You have Instagram models that get 1 million likes on an Instagram post when they take a bikini pic and show their ass. And some of those people want to talk about health and wellness. They want to talk about psychological safety. They want to talk about their job. But if they talked about one of those things, if they wouldn't get 1 million likes on their post, like their ass shot bikini, they would get 47 likes. And because they care more about the likes than doing the things that they like, they get trapped in a place where they can only post certain things because they're pandering to what the algorithm wants. And so I recommend people do not get stuck in that place, because it will lead to a lot of personal dissatisfaction. And so being comfortable in the evolution of your content and the ebbs and flows of your engagement, if you're going about this for a long period of time, I think is very important. Otherwise, you will burn out, you will be dissatisfied, you will not be interested in the things that you're talking about. And I think that's something that's been really true to me over the past couple of years that I haven't shared a lot with other people yet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing came to mind with that is like this is a forcing function, like the content engine piece. It's a forcing function to create content, but it's also a forcing function to get better at creating content. Like the more you teach and the more that you do, the better you're going to get at it. Like to your point, and I think that's part of one thing truly of what is preventing some CEOs and execs at companies from creating content is that going from 0 to 1, they've got the domain expertise, but they haven't really had to articulate it to a large group of people in this way before. And I think it's helpful. I've heard you share this before, and I think every single content creator in B2B, just creators in general, influencers, like their early content is night and day from what it was and from what it is today. Like, quantity to get to quality is something that, I really believe in. Like just the nature of being prolific will lead you to get to quality. and it will help you spur new ideas and where to take your content and stuff like that. So like getting the reps in, to your point, I think is huge for all of that. We're getting quite a few questions. Let's do a couple more here from me, Chris, and then we'll jump into some questions. So the
Could I just make a
post-production.
note on that? Yeah, before you go there,
Yeah,
could I
go
just make
ahead.
a note on some of the things that you said?
Mhm.
Like in this journey, the journey of like this content model is very similar to going to the gym. And I want to talk about this from a longevity perspective. You can go to the gym for 3 months, but if you stop at 3 months and then you think that, oh, now I'm just going to watch people exercise, or I'm going to have somebody else exercise for me or something like that, and you stop doing it, that the results are going to stop too, and you will go backwards. And so thinking about it like that, because some people think, like founders think, oh, I'll just do this content thing for 3 months. And then once I do it for 3 months, then I can hire a marketing manager and they'll do it for me. And all of a sudden that'll be great. It never works like that. And so when you are doing this, you have to go into it similar to like if you're trying to go to be in shape. It's not just about getting into shape, it's about staying in shape. And so thinking about it like that, I think is a good mindset to have. And then it's just like, we're in like a lot of the people that listen to the show that are thinking about doing this podcast are in competitive, fast moving markets. Some with companies that raise hundreds of millions of dollars and deploy that capital for growth, where maybe someone listening to the show is at a bootstrapped company. And in those times, if you have two people that have equal talent and have an equal product and have all those things, but one person produces 100 pieces of content a day and the other person produces one piece of content a day, that over a period of a year, the person that produced 100 will be way better at making content. Just like somebody that shoots a basketball 1,000 times a day is going to be better than someone that shoots one time a day with equal talent. The learnings compound. If you look at my content from 2020 when I was with Katana on a webcam to my just ability to speak and communicate concepts clearly to people today, it's a night and day difference. And the reason is because I put in reps consistently to get better. This is producing content, sharing your thoughts, public speaking is a skill. It can be practiced, it can be learned. It doesn't matter where you start. I was not good at it at the beginning. I was nervous being in front of a 20-person audience on Zoom, and you slowly get better. And I think that thinking about it as a skill that carries with you for the rest of your career, just like sales, just like understanding finance, just like EQ and emotional intelligence, these are skills and talents that you can build that become advantages for the rest of your career and your life. So those are some, I just wanted to put a couple of those thoughts in there before we move to probably something a little bit more tactical.
No, love that. Yeah. Totally agree. So on the, yeah, a couple more from me, and then we'll dive into some of the questions from the audience. So from a practical standpoint, we've got, which you and I will probably do a session on another time, on like creating differentiated content. So we kind of obviously skip that piece here. Like this is the content engine, and a bit about how to do it, but it's obviously step one is creating something that people want to consume. Like the substance matters far more than the wrapper or the engine. Like being efficient at something that's not effective is not a good strategy. And so it has to be something that people want to consume for it to be effective. We'll probably cover that in a future session. But we've recorded it. We've got a series going. We've got our pillar going. How do we then actually operationalize that? Like, let's talk about that. I think for, a few minutes, like, because time is, I mean, like for yourself, like, running a company with dozens and dozens and dozens of employees, and the calendar is a Tetris board. And now somebody's coming and saying, content is the future. You cannot outsource your articulation of your points of views and your thoughts to a content marketer or anything like that. You have to be the face of it. So we've got to now fit that into the calendar. But what we want to do is minimize the impact to the calendar as much as possible, and get as much leverage from it as possible, and do that as efficiently as possible. And sometimes these content teams are not huge. It could be one content marketer, trying to manage this on behalf of their subject matter expert or the CEO or someone in the C-suite. who's, you know, the front facing person for it. So what have you learned in your experience of sort of operationalizing this to like make the actual production process efficient, so that it eases the burden on you as the face of it and then also the leader of the company, to where you don't have the time to like double check every single little thing and, you know, make sure it's up on, you know, Apple and Spotify and YouTube and the title is correct and all those things, like, which you may want to be a part of some of that stuff in the beginning to kind of get the V1 down, but then you obviously, you know, don't want to do that on a repeatable, you know, weekly basis. So yeah, what have you learned from that standpoint?
Yeah, I was just giving advice on this specific topic to Adam Robinson, who's another CEO that's executing this strategy very well, and shamelessly talks about how he copies my strategy. And I appreciate that. I invite anyone to copy this exact strategy for your audience and your stuff. There's a difference between copying thoughts, which I think is disingenuous, versus copying a framework and a strategy, which I think is smart. And so I was giving this advice to Adam because he was working on the same thing. And I was like, you can give me all the context, but I already know the answer. It's going to shortcut people that are working on this a very long time. So you have the thought leader. You do not want, who in this case is me, in that case is Adam, executive, whoever's doing it at your company. You have the thought leader. You do not want the thought leader managing processes, managing an external agency, running things through AI, figuring out what the title should be, writing the show notes for podcast, um, trying to figure out whether you should use Google Drive or Box to put the videos in. You do not want that expensive, typically has another day job resource to be doing those things. And so the recommendation is to have one in-house, like the architect of the content. You could call it the production manager, you could call it the architect, you could call it whatever you want to call the job. That is the person that is responsible for all of the operational capabilities of getting things done. So the thought leader, all they have to do is show up, talk and share their advice, and then wait for the assets that they can post on the channels that they're going to be posting and writing the copy for, which is at least LinkedIn. I do LinkedIn. Somebody else is going to write the show notes for the podcast. Somebody else is going to write the show notes for our YouTube long form. And so you can decide where the thought leader is actually going to do handwritten distribution versus somebody else. I personally I've come into a studio now and I block out my content. So I record content for, usually it's 3 hours a week. This week it was 7 hours or 8 hours. But usually it's 3 hours a week. I block 1, 2, 3 events, podcasts, guest spots, and then all the content production happens in 3 hours. And then after that, all I have to do is do some of the posting. And then I believe that the architect, that one resource, their job is the interface of getting all the raw assets and then leveraging either external firms, like a company like Hatch, who does our video editing and production and podcast post-production, all that stuff, and or some AI tool, some combination of those two things, to take all those raw assets, repurpose them, and then either push them back into the distribution channel straight away or serve them up to me. Like I have a Google Doc that I log into that has all the different podcast episodes, has all the different micro videos that have been in there. I can either search, I can browse, I can find the video that I want to post about, I can write the copy, and then I post it on LinkedIn. And so in short, you do not need a lot of resources. I think using outsourcing in a combination with AI is smart for this type of workflow now. You need somebody ideally in-house, but you might be able to get it done with a contractor freelancer that's basically the interface between the thought leader and all of the production workflows. And that would be the setup. And I don't think you'd ever need much more than that. I think that can sustain the level of volume for a long time. And then if you add a specialist or you add a new channel, maybe you need a new person, maybe you need a outsourced resource, maybe you can get a lot of it done with a technology or tool.
And what's really interesting about that is you have basically QA tested that process at probably one of the highest volumes of content creation, you know, in B2B. So like if that makeup of the team and the structure and the process is sufficient to power the amount of volume you're doing for the content engine that then powers your other channels, it definitely will work for companies who are doing, a once a week cadence or twice a month, whatever's manageable. And both of those can work as well. You don't have to start at the volume that you're doing now, obviously. But yeah, we've seen the same thing too, where like if it's the founder who is also serving as the role of the content architect or the producer or the content manager, it usually breaks down at about month 2 or 3, where it's just simply not sustainable. And then there's gaps in the cadence and the release schedule. And basically it just breaks down to where it's like fits and starts, and there's almost no point in there's not no point in doing it, but it's pretty close to no point in doing it with that sort of cadence. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned AI. This will be my last question before we kind of go into some of the audience questions. How are you thinking about AI, maybe even from like the workflow perspective, of course, like you mentioned a little bit of that. I think it's really helpful for early stage startups who are kind of DIYing this a little bit to leverage some of that and then up level their quality with either more team members or outsourced, experts and things like that over time. But also, how are you looking at AI for the quality piece as well? Like, how can AI enhance the content engine, but also the quality of the creation of the content and the output of it?
Yeah, let's do it. I'll just be very transparent and direct about the one use case that we're currently experimenting with on AI, with the caveat of the um, the prerequisites that I have, having done and recorded content for the past 5 years that most people don't have, which I consider a competitive advantage. So
Mm.
if you look at from when I started doing this until now, I've recorded more than 550 hours of audio content. All of that audio content has now been transcribed with AI into written transcripts of all that content. That content and the transcripts are now loaded into an AI database that understands my brand voice, the way that I speak, all the different patterns and the things that I've talked about, all the questions that people have asked before and things like that. And then leveraging AI to write written content that has been trained on the things that I've said for the past 5 years in a long tail SEO strategy is the thing that we're experimenting with right now. But you would never get there if you didn't have the 550 hours of transcripts. And so that's something that we're actively testing. Interested to see how it goes. And that's the main one that I'm spending time with on AI right now, especially because I prefer to communicate in video and audio form rather than sitting down and writing something. And so this provides a new way for me to be in the written medium, a new way for me to approach an SEO strategy, a new way for my audience to be able to consume the information and get the answer to something rather than searching for minute 37 of episode 157 to just get the answer in a written post. And so that is the main one that I have a lot of excitement about.
Yeah, I mean, basically, like that will work now, but it's also future proofing this a little bit. Like the archives can be thought of as essentially like a library of future content that can get imported basically into the AI tool and then exported out lots of different formats of written content, uh literally like a book. Like you could literally go through these 550 hours of Chris Walker's content and create a book with this title from stemming from these topics that were talked about over those 550 hours. Like something that would have taken, a team, a human team of multiple people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to like go through. That day is coming, but the original thoughts and the points of view and the expertise like still has to come from you, obviously. And so that's where like this library accumulation over time is actually a really powerful marketing asset, that I think, AI will just get better and better at being able to repurpose into other stuff. So let's get into some of our questions here. Erik, let's get some people queued up. Blaine Blaine asked a really good question. Blaine, if you maybe would want to come on and ask your question related to getting leadership buy-in.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing
Hey, Blaine.
awesome. Good to have you.
So, I had a question I added on Erik's post yesterday, but let's say I believe this, I have all buy-in. I'm a marketing director at a company, I'm a marketing manager, and my leaders kind of mention this, my CEO, and I want to pitch it to him. You know, whether I'm making my 2024 Q3, Q4 plan, maybe next year, I'm like, I want my team to do this. We'll do the kind of in-house operations. We'll kind of get this fired up. Can you provide sort of like a framework or ideas on how to pitch this upstream to leadership? And like, again, I just think a lot of leaders might recognize this as maybe a nice to have, but how do I really reinforce this as this is the current playbook? This is the strategy that's going to get us to pipeline and revenue.
Step one is to understand the context inside of the current business performance and future outlook. Is the company way behind their plan, or are they looking for acceleration to get to the next level? I do not recommend implementing this type of strategy on a company that's consistently missing their plan, because 15 days into it, they're going to say, where are the leads, or we're behind plan, or sales needs this, or da-da-da-da-da, and it's going to get shut down. When you're starting this, you need to be in a position of strength as a business. You need to be looking for, how do we get to the next level, not we're behind the level that we need to be at. So there's a timing element that really needs to be right, and understanding the context around that. So that's sort of step one. There's an optional element that I'll add into step two, which I think is a nice to have, but can be really powerful, which is whether through a survey to your target accounts, or interviews of people, or something. You could use Winter or something like that to get 20 responses or survey responses, and ask people, who are the people that you trust in the industry? Where are the places that you learn? Here's the 10 different sources of information: Gartner, a sales rep, YouTube, a thought leader, 10 different things. Rank these from 1 to 10 on the things you trust the most to the least. You can ask certain questions to get insights from your target accounts that will give you data that likely supports doing this, because I did this exact thing in 2017 that supported us doing these things. And if anything, we've gone further in this spectrum from what customers want and do versus farther away. And then lastly, it's the strategy around the pitch, which is, who do you want to are you asking the CEO to be the host of the podcast? Is that part of the pitch? Or are you going to be the host, and you're going to go out and interview either people in the company, or thought leaders, or customers? So thinking about whose time is required in order to actually do this, and have a backup plan around that. Like, my plan was, okay, let's have our this is back in 2017, our chief medical officer is going to be the main person that we interview on the podcast. He was like, I have way too much, other things to do. I don't have time to write a blog. I don't have time to be on your little podcast. Like, go do something else. I don't have time for this. And so I did the first 8 episodes by interviewing external thought leaders that used our product. And then after 8 episodes, then he wanted to be on the podcast. And so not being okay if someone internally doesn't buy into it initially, that you can take control, go out to external people, use that as the key thing to get the people internally excited or interested about doing it. Those are some of the tips. And then, I mean, ideally, there's some level of a financial justification for it. And so that's obviously hard to predict, because it's very predicated on how good you are, how much volume you do, the channels that you're using. It's very hard to say, we're going to launch this podcast and it's going to get us, $1.7 million in net new ARR next year. It's hard to do that with a new program. And so staging out, instead of trying to put a plan together from that, think about gates or progress steps of the things that you want to see. The first thing we want to see is 25 people showing up to our weekly event that have these titles or work for these companies. That's the first goal. The next goal is that we want to send out a survey and have positive sentiment from the people that join that match our target accounts or something. The third thing we want to see is that at least 4 people come to our website and request a demo that said that they heard about us through either a podcast, LinkedIn, or something like that. And stage it out instead of trying to have this big goal long term. Break it into little chunks that demonstrate progress over a shorter period of time. And then lastly, it would be, if we're going to do this, then what aren't we going to do instead? And trying to look at the available things that you're already doing right now, find the one that is clearly working the worst, and eliminate that one and replace it with this, rather than this being a net new thing that costs additional budget. Get rid of something that isn't working that costs money and use this instead. I can use AI to write a blog about that. That was like my best answer. I've gotten asked that question a lot. That was my best answer I've ever had for that one.
That was killer. Awesome. Blaine, thanks for asking that. Sean Rains, if you'd be willing to jump on here and ask your question. You did a really great question around something that, Chris, you have a lot of experience with, of podcast guesting versus creating your own branded, own channel podcast. So Sean, if you're available.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
We got you.
Yep.
Good to have you here.
Great. Yeah. In specific, when I mentioned industry in this question, I serve the automotive industry. I've been in it for 25 years. So I'm really curious to know your thoughts around companies who are reluctant. Well, it doesn't have to be the CEO, but their subject matter experts are unwilling to start their own podcast as a content creation pillar, but they're more than happy to be guests on podcasts within their industry, podcasts that have their own brands. And although it's similar industry, it appears that, and I think you guys are the perfect example of it, but the greatest value for a company would be to have their own podcast or an interview capture of the subject matter experts, in addition to then also guesting on other podcasts. I'd just love to know your thoughts on that, because that can be a sticking point for people who just talk themselves out of doing it on their own, but they'll be more than happy to do it within other industry related podcasts. Love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, like probably a third of the podcasts that I've ever published have been me being a guest on someone else's podcast that then get posted on my own podcast. And so the owned asset is essential, and the owned asset of a podcast, social media platforms, and things like that actually drive guest spots, speaking slots at conferences, and other things like that. So before, the process of being on a podcast, being a guest on a podcast or speaking at a conference would be, let's hire a PR firm and have them go and pitch our, CTO that nobody's ever heard of, that doesn't have a social media profile, about why we should interview our CTO. Where now it's own your own channels, and then people see that and say, wow, this person's got a lot of interesting stuff to say. Let me invite them onto my podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a reverse of how you think about owned, and how owned drives earned, not the other way around. And so here's what I would do in your situation. They're already being a guest on podcasts. Get those recordings, right? Don't make it be your thought leader's name on the podcast. Put it under the company and just have them be the person speaking. Set up a separate thing, whether it's a monthly webinar or something like that, or they speak at conferences, or they're doing something where you're recording that as well, and just mash those two things together and create a podcast that does 2 or 4 episodes a month. They're already doing all of the work to make the podcast, so you might as well put a name on it and publish against it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good. I appreciate that. And it helps them building their own brand, right? Versus, when you're guesting, it's great, and repurposing it is great, but seems like companies that then talk themselves out of doing their own, they're missing out on the brand recognition and building really to their own audience. Sometimes there's similarity in industry, but you might be deeply in automotive, you might be deep in a niche, and it seems like it's a miss if you don't have both. So I appreciate the feedback. That's a great answer.
For sure. And I just want to make this point, not necessarily for you, but for everybody. It doesn't, like, you're the architect in this situation. Yeah. It doesn't matter how good the architect is. If the thought leader doesn't want to do it, then it will never be successful and it will never be sustainable. And I've been in this situation before in the reverse where I'm not the thought leader, I'm the architect, and the thought leader is not bought into it, doesn't care about like whether people in the industry know them, doesn't want to put in the effort, thinks that supporting a sales meeting would be way more effective than spending the same hour doing a podcast or an event that 500 people attend. A lot of that message is for the thought leader, actually, not the but it's good for both roles to know that. But there is no, like in your situation, you can hack some things together to create a podcast that does 4 episodes a week or 4 episodes a month based on what the person is already doing. But if they don't, the things that you said, if they don't really care about those things, then it's going to fail long term. You either have to figure out how to get the engine running for them to see the insight of, hey, this is really valuable. Like, there's ways to get that done. But if they don't see that insight, then it'll eventually crash and burn.
Yeah, and the last piece I'll mention on that, Sean, is one of the ways to help them get comfortable with it, because creating your own podcast is a much bigger lift than going and being a guest on some podcasts, is by doing some guesting first, especially if they've never done it before, and getting some reps in, getting some comfortability, being behind the mic, talking to, people doing a digital recording, and then parlaying that into, okay, hey, we're already doing this. Like you said, Chris, like, let's go ahead and create our own. But it is ideal to do less of that so that when you do those, less of that prior to doing your own, so that when you do continue to do them, you can drive people back to your podcast, because it's one of the best ways to grow your show, is podcast to podcast marketing like that, which kind of parlays right into Dale's question as we're kind of getting to the final few minutes here, which was a great question, Dale, if you're willing to jump on here, around, the distribution and the growth of increasing the reach of the content, the pillar asset on, the channels that it's posted on, YouTube, podcasts, things like that, beyond just the clips. So Chris, Dale, maybe if you want to hop on and clarify a little bit of that question, but I think it's a really good topic.
Yeah, so our podcast is about 6 years in, and we're about 600,000 downloads. So, like, it's been effective for a while, but I think we reached that point where there's a growth trajectory we need to take, because we're on a bit of a plateau. Like, we've had some percentage increases year on year, but we need to kind of pick up on distribution. And I see the effectiveness of social and sharing stuff organically and posting it, and putting some paid behind it to give it extra reach. What I'm kind of lacking or not seeing a lot of is recommendations around how to use other distribution channels to bring people onto the podcast, or to get listens or views if we also have the video as well. Like, what other distribution channels we can use to make people more aware, because I don't necessarily see standard discovery via the platforms themselves being particularly effective. Like, what other ways would you recommend, or if you at least tested and seen positive or negative results from?
What's the title of your podcast?
Digital Marketing Podcast by Exposure Ninja.
The Digital Marketing Podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So it's already well search optimized, and there are people that are going to search digital marketing in Apple Podcasts and look for something. So there's like a discoverability there that I think is undervalued in podcasts. But the name of the show, I know that we showed up number 1 when my podcast was called State of Demand Gen, and a lot of people searched State of Demand Gen in the podcast and discovered my podcast that way. So that's one. Increasing reviews, and this is all in platform marketing, like in the podcast platform, but increasing reviews, and instead of having 100 reviews, having 500 reviews can make a difference in discoverability in platform. Then when you think about going out of platform, the number one driver of new podcast listeners will be sharing and word of mouth from other people. So the number one thing is thinking about, is there a way to increase the quality and the shareability of our podcast content? So somebody takes an episode, clicks the 3 buttons on an iPhone and shares it to somebody else saying, hey, you should check this out. Whether that comes through Slack or a text message, word of mouth is going to drive a lot of that stuff, because it's a big ask to have someone commit and listen to your 1-hour digital marketing show. If it gets shared by a friend, it becomes a lot more interesting for someone to take that leap and commit that time. Another way that you can do it is to prove your credibility in a place that it has less of a barrier to entry. Or instead of listening to an hour of our podcast, if I show you 30 seconds of how good this podcast is in a TikTok video, maybe that will interest you enough to go and consume the whole thing, which was a ton of the growth in the State of Demand with the podcast that I've built, which was post the video on LinkedIn for 3 minutes and then always link to the podcast episode in the first comment and drive people off of that from the short form into the long form. And so the short form to long form play on platforms that have organic reach would be probably the best opportunity. And then you need to figure out what is the best, like if it's a broad digital marketing podcast that can work in B2B and B2C and agencies and all that stuff, then like TikTok might actually be the way, and explaining simple concepts that get cut from the podcast, using that and then linking back on a TikTok asset could actually be the most effective way to drive new subscribers. So continuously thinking about, how do I improve the content quality? Is there a new format? Is there a new show? Is there a way that we can do a new style? Should we have a new live show that's all Q&A? Thinking about how do we improve the content quality, and then also thinking about this concept of using short form distribution to gain long form subscribers.
Another thing I'll mention on this too, Dale, I know we're a couple minutes over, but for anybody staying, like this will be really tactical on this one, which is adding a little bit more on top of what Chris said too, is using a platform. So basically with if the show's a digital marketing podcast, there are hundreds of other podcasts out there right now that are serving that same audience that you should collaborate with. And whether that's guesting on them or doing an episode drop swap or sponsoring them or what have you, but not for the purpose of marketing your company, but for the purpose of driving net new audience to your content. And so there's a platform, I'm not affiliated with them at all, but I just really love it. It's called Rephonic. Rephonic.com, I believe is the URL, REPHONIC. If you type in your category, it will give you a list of the other podcasts in your category, and it will give you all the information on them, including the email address of the hosts. So you can use that to find ways to collaborate with them, and put an episode of yours in their feed or guest on it or what have you. And getting people who are already listening to marketing podcasts to then come over and listen to yours is a far easier ask than getting them from a Facebook ad or LinkedIn or email over to the podcast app and listening to it there. So yeah, just one thing on that. There was a ton more I wish we could have got to.
Just want to close that. Do not run ads to get podcast subscribers. It's not worth it. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, this was amazing. There was a lot more we obviously could have jammed on. We're going to do more of this in the future, everybody. So Chris and I will probably be doing this every month or so on a different topic. And yeah, really appreciate everybody being here, and hope it was valuable. Chris, thank you for the time. And yeah, we'll catch everybody on the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here. I love talking about this stuff and love the format to be able to share all these details. So appreciate you being here. Hope to see you for the next one.